the wage gap conversation is the most important part of this data set that we're talking about here, right? You have the headline being the $1.4 billion, whereas the real story is the wage gap, right? There's a large gap between wages that are earned at jobs located in Detroit and wages earned by Detroit residents. And so the translation of that is that a lot of higher earners commute into the city of Detroit, but they don't live here in the city of Detroit. Detroit might quietly be one of the best run major urban cities in the country right now. And I'm not saying that from a hype standpoint. I'm saying that from a numbers standpoint. Think about it. This is a city that went through the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. A city that had to literally rebuild its balance sheet from the ground up. A city that was written off nationally for years. Fast forward to now, we're looking at $1.4 billion in general tax revenue. We're looking at projected employment growth through 2030. We're looking at rising resident wages. We're looking at stabilized finances. All of that isn't accidental. That is what we call discipline. Now, does that mean Detroit doesn't have challenges? Absolutely not. Poverty is still high. Inequality still real. But when you compare fiscal management, budget discipline, revenue forecasting, and structural resilience across all urban cities in this country, Detroit is operating from a position of strength. And that's the conversation we need to have more openly. So in this video, I want to react to the latest economic forecast and break down what it actually means, not just for headlines, but for everyday Detroiters. Because growth is one thing, but how that growth is actually structured, that's what really determines whether a city is well run. Let's get into it.
Now a look at the future of Detroit and its economy. New report finds good news is on the horizon when it comes to employment, wages, and income. According to an estimate of the city's finances, Detroit's total general tax revenue will grow to more than $1.4 billion this fiscal year. That's up more than $39 million from the year before. It's largely because of the rise of internet gaming and sports betting, along with increased property values. And now we're getting a better idea of how the city is going to fare over the next 5 years. The Detroit economic forecast for 2025 to 2030 is out. It was prepared by a partnership between the city, University of Michigan, Michigan State University, and Wayne State. And joining us now to talk about it is Gabriel Ehrlich, the University of Michigan economist who co-authored this report. Good to have you with us. Good morning. Walk me through this news. How good is this for Detroit?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I would say that it is positive news because, Detroit has been facing a pretty tough external environment over the past couple of years. When you think about high interest rates, volatile tariffs, and trade policy, it's been a lot for the city's economy to handle, and the city has hung in there. We do expect a little bit of a soft patch in growth this year, but we expect growth to be picking up as we go through the year. And then, moderate but continued growth through 2030 from here. So I think that's good news.
Do you think it'll be powered by the same kinds of things that helped it grow this time around? Is that going to stay consistent? Or, like you said, there's a lot of variables in there. Could things change?
A lot of variables in there. Things absolutely can change. We do expect to continue getting a little bit of relief on interest rates. Detroit's economy is very interest rate sensitive. The auto industry, the mortgage industry are both, industries that really react to interest rates. So we do think that will help. And then a growing national economy will also help.
Wow. So $1.4 billion in revenue. Very, very impressive. And yes, a $39 million year over year growth is really solid as well. But the real headline here is stability, right? This is the real headline that we need to be highlighting when we're watching and digesting this data. Detroit is operating from a position of post-bankruptcy fiscal discipline. Revenue is actually growing despite the high interest rate environment that we're currently in, the trade and tariff volatility that we're currently dealing with, the remote work pressure and the challenges of office space and these empty buildings that a lot of the country is dealing with, less so when it comes to the city of Detroit proper, but the city of Detroit also has that challenge as well, and a pretty big loss and some federal dollars that, to be honest, felt a lot more plentiful via the previous administration in comparison to today's environment. But this is definitely resilience under stress, right? The city of Detroit is really showing how a city should be ran, and we're in position to really benefit in the long run. This is important for things such as bond ratings, right? When the city of Detroit is going out to borrow dollars to help with the repair of roads or affordable housing, the higher the bond rating or the rating of the city, the lower the interest rate the city of Detroit is going to be able to gain access to based off of the historical performance of the city and the stability of the city as a whole, right? And of course, institutional investors, they see this as a more stable place to invest in. And of course, developers, right? Developers love to build in cities that have a little bit more stability as opposed to volatility. And the city of Detroit had a bit of volatility for quite a long period of time. And there were a number of developers that still took that chance and invested in the city when it was in that volatile time frame. But now the city is a little bit more stable. And so now we're attracting a different level of development here in the city of Detroit.
Tax revenue grew up to $1.42 billion, powered by internet gaming, sports betting, rising property values, and utilities. And we also have to keep in mind, in Detroit, there are about 220,000 people living in poverty. And when you look at those two sides of it, it almost feels counterproductive. Is it possible Detroit's improving, yet at the detriment of its most vulnerable citizens?
I want to point out here that 220,000 residents here in the city of Detroit are living at or below the poverty line. That's about 35% of the totality of the city of Detroit residents. That's a pretty telling tale when it comes to the health of a city. And we are hoping that that continuously decreases and you have an opportunity where the residents of the city of Detroit gain access to the skill set, the knowledge, the know-how to be able to have access to careers that help them get out of that poverty category, which further solidifies the success of the city of Detroit.
It's a really important question. One of the things that we point out in our report, so first off, there is a very large gap between the wages that are earned at jobs located in the city and the average wages earned by Detroit residents. And obviously, because of commuting patterns, those are two different groups of jobs. But something that we point out is since the bankruptcy, the average wages of Detroit residents have been rising more quickly than the wages earned at jobs in the city of Detroit. And we do expect that to continue. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. We do expect a big gap to remain. Obviously, there is a lot of inequality in the Detroit economy, but we do expect that gap to be shrinking some over time as we go through to 2030.
The wage gap conversation is the most important part of this data set that we're talking about here, right? You have the headline being the $1.4 billion, whereas the real story is the wage gap, right? There's a large gap between wages that are earned at jobs located in Detroit and wages earned by Detroit residents. And so the translation of that is that a lot of higher earners commute into the city of Detroit, but they don't live here in the city of Detroit. With that said, resident wages are rising faster post bankruptcy, and that would suggest that there is some internal upward mobility, but inequality still remains high. So growth is happening, but distribution is extremely important, and it definitely still matters here. But the 220,000 people currently in poverty here in the city of Detroit in 2026, that's the real tension that can be cut with a butter knife, right? That is something that we need to continuously question, right? How can revenues grow while poverty remains as high as it is now?
I know a lot of times the city will bank on folks from the suburbs coming in. A lot of those folks go to the casinos, or they do gamble on sports gaming and things like that. Are you able to put numbers on that specifically, or?
So we focus on the economy, and the city actually produces its revenue forecast. So I won't be able to put numbers directly on the internet gaming versus coming into the casinos. Obviously, that is an important revenue source for the city.
This was mentioned earlier in the video by Gabrielle, but the growth is actually coming from internet gaming, sports betting, property value appreciation, and utilities. Right? That's kind of interesting, right? Internet gaming. Sports betting, the gaming and betting is consumption-based revenue, and your property value increase and appreciation is asset inflation-based revenue. And so that's actually different from industrial expansion, advanced manufacturing. So the key question becomes here, is Detroit expanding productive capacity or monetizing existing activity more efficiently?
We have a new mayor coming in, starting her first term. This is obviously going to be great news and a good launching pad for her when she looks at it. What's the best case scenario over the next few years if Detroit stays on this track?
Yeah, I think that we do expect Detroit to continue growing. We expect employment to get back above where it was before the pandemic. If we do really get relief on interest rates, one thing we're looking for is for the mortgage industry and the finance industry in the city to rebound. One policy change recently is that the penalties for missing the so-called corporate average fuel economy standards, or the CAFE standards, have effectively been eliminated. Without getting into the environmental costs of that policy, we do think that should boost the Detroit 3 because they sell a lot of low mileage vehicles. So we do think that some policy changes should provide a boost to the local economy. So there is upside there.
Don't get it twisted. The auto industry is still extremely, extremely important to the vitality of the city of Detroit. We have all three automakers here in the Motor City still building cars and providing jobs to Detroiters. The city also depends on mortgage activity. Shout out to Dan Gilbert for really transforming the downtown district in a format that probably wouldn't have happened without having him as part of the overall fabric of the city. With that said, Detroit is extremely interest rate sensitive. And if rates happen to ease a little bit, auto sales rebound, mortgage originations increase, development restarts, and refinance activity rises, right? That could actually create a secondary growth wave from 2026 to 2028. And if rates actually stay higher, well, Detroit feels it more than your diversified economies will, right? And so we're really hoping that interest rates continue to fall because we in turn will, as a city, benefit more so than most other urban cities across the country.
Obviously, Detroit continues to face challenges, but when we look at the data, we do think that the city has made a lot of progress since the bankruptcy. I think that does come through in the numbers. And Detroit has faced, some tough years since the pandemic. Obviously, the shift to remote work is tough for central business districts all across the country. But we do think Detroit has, shown a lot of resilience over the past couple of years. And we think that the external environment should become more favorable for Detroit as we move through this year and into the future.
Most definitely, right? Today's Detroit is not the fragile city of 2008, right? Detroit's structural position is a lot stronger post bankruptcy, right? Financial oversight has drastically improved. You have long-term liabilities that have been restructured. Budget discipline is also improved. And so that is an important macro distinction here. And of course, the revenue continues to rise, but it is important to point out how revenue growth is not the same as household wealth growth, right? The city revenue rising the way it is doesn't necessarily correlate to residents building wealth. And so a few things that we need to ask here is home ownership rising, right? Are Detroit residents starting more businesses? Are skilled trades pipelines expanding? That's wealth creation versus revenue collection. And that is a very, very important topic that we need to continue to have discussions around. Detroit is no longer the cautionary tale. Detroit is no longer the city on life support. And Detroit is not operating from desperation anymore. It's operating from discipline. Revenue is growing. Wages are rising. Employment is projected to expand. The city's finances are actually stable. That's not luck. That's real structure. The real test is whether Detroit can actually grow intelligently. Can the city convert rising property values into generational wealth for its residents, not just higher tax bills? Can it convert internet gaming revenue into real human capital investment? Can it shrink the wage gap between jobs located here and residents who live here? Can it leverage auto industry momentum without becoming overexposed to one sector again? Let's be honest, we've seen this movie before, right? Growth without distribution leads to tension. Asset appreciation without ownership leads to displacement. Revenue expansion without structural reform leads to stagnation. If Detroit gets this next phase right, we won't just be talking about a comeback city. We'll be talking about a model. An urban city that went through bankruptcy, rebuilt its financial house, modernized its governance, and emerged leaner, smarter, and more resilient than cities that never had to reset. That's the opportunity in front of Detroit right now. But opportunity does not automatically equal outcome. Execution does. And the next 5 years will determine whether Detroit is just growing or whether it's becoming the most strategically run urban city in the country. Thanks for listening to me ramble. Would love to know your thoughts in the comment section below. See you in the next video.